أنا اسمي ساره سواتصاف. أنا طالبة في جامعة أعمل الدكتوراه في دراسة أفريقية، ولكن متخصصة في علوم السياسية. أنا كمان مدرسة العلوم السياسية في عدة الجامعات في منطقتي في أمريكا. والموضوع أنا اخترت في رسالتي العلاقة بين اثيوبيا واليمن والهجرة بين الاثنين في تاريخ، وكمان الآن في عصر الحرب في اليمن كيف يتحرك الناس. وهذا موضوع مهم، وبالنسبة لي كانت فرصة رائعة أتعرف على هذه المجتمع هنا، العائدين من اليمن بجنسية اثيوبيا وأيضا اللاجئين اليمني. The main research findings are that Yemeni refugees and Ethiopian returnees are not two separate groups or separate communities, that they have significant overlap, and yet at the same time their bureaucratic status often prevents them from accessing the same services, or for example a family reuniting or accessing eligibility for resettlement. Those kinds of opportunities, essentially like both the rights of returnees and the rights of refugees are hindered by the lack of acknowledgement that many families or extended families or groups of friends and communities have mixed status. So we've seen in the academic literature the term mixed migration is used more often, but in a very general sense, and that term is still not really accounting for the complexity of migrant and refugee experiences. I'm still analyzing the interview data, and I'm still reading migration literature and getting caught up on the current scholarship. But I look forward to finalizing many of my research findings this coming year and writing more on this topic. I think that this is an important topic because oftentimes, at least in Western universities, we study Africa and the Middle East separately, and it puts us at a disadvantage when it comes to understanding how policies are impacting people when they move back and forth between East Africa and the Middle East. From a history perspective, the topic of Indian Ocean cosmopolitanism became more popular in recent years, but oftentimes, the focus on history doesn't recognize the fact that people are still moving around between East Africa and Arabia, and their family ties and their right to movement are both being hindered by migration policies and bureaucratic categories that you could say prevent people from, you could say that people are prevented from living in a way that naturally reflects their heritage ties and their family ties, their culture and their religion, because of state boundaries, migration policies, the limitations of rights for people who are non-citizens. So I think that ultimately the research will result in a number of policy recommendations, not just for me, but policy recommendations made by refugees and returnees themselves that actually reflect the same criticisms and recommendations that we're seeing come out of the, kind of like critical scholarship on migration. So I think that's really one of the major findings of the research, is that migrants and refugees themselves are very accurate in their criticisms of the policies that are impacting them. And once again, their criticisms reflect a lot of the prevailing criticisms in academic literature. And I think bringing those two together, like the political theory and the lived experiences, could help us all understand problems with borders and legal status that impact people in every country. Well, personally, I think that it's very difficult for any group of people to achieve change without some kind of organizing or organization. That organization, it doesn't have to be a conventional NGO, but people have to organize themselves and create some kind of unity and power and shared goals. through those shared goals and the shared responsibility of running an organization, people can do a number of things. They can raise awareness, they can educate the larger public, and then eventually a large enough group will wield some amount of social or economic power, not just necessarily within one country, but maybe by networking internationally, that can be used to pressure towards change, positive change in policy. But I think more than that, we think about changes in policy are important because policies that are hurting people right now need to be addressed as soon as possible so that people are living with a little bit less harm or a little bit less hurt. But if we think about mid-range and long-term goals, those are much harder to achieve unless we're creating organizations that reflect the society that we want to live in. So if we look around, whether it's in the United States or here in Ethiopia or in Yemen, and we think that there's shortcomings in the government and the prevailing politics, we don't feel that we're represented or that decisions are made in a democratic way, then it's partly on us to create organizations that practice, because it takes practice, it takes trial and error. It's not going to be a perfect organization when it's first created. Create organizations that reflect the values and the right governance that we want to live by, and then keep expanding that, and that becomes a model for the change we want to see at the city or state level. I think that there's a strong community here, but like in any other big city, people are spread out. So you need some resources and financial support to be able to bring people together, to create a center or support small businesses. You can think of it as kind of creating nodes throughout a large city where that you have kind of neighborhood hubs for a given community or organization, and then together you're stronger. I think it will take some financial support, and that's why I'm interested in organizations networking internationally, because when we support each other in different countries, those benefits come back to us. And I know that in the city that I grew up in Washington, D.C., the Ethiopian diaspora community is very active in union organizing, workplace organizing, and in social justice. An Ethiopian American filmmaker even made a film recently about changes faced by the Black community in Washington, D.C. I think that, I want to say some years ago, when the head or vice president of a prominent union organization is an Ethiopian American individual. So, we learned in the U.S., social justice organizing is very influenced by migrant and refugee experiences, immigrant experiences. And I think that the same applies to any country as we network to create a global movement for migration justice. The short answer is that the organization needs to figure that out for itself. It's I would say that migrants and refugees here are the experts in the migrant and refugee experience here. So the more that you bring people together and create relationships of what we would call mutual aid, of mutual support, then you can put a process in place where people analyze their situation together and figure out together, what are the best goals, whether it's advocacy or policy change at the national or international level. I tend to think a lot of times academics or scholars are asked to be a kind of expert in a given area and say exactly what should be changed or analyze exactly what's happening. And I think of organizations as operating more with a process. You put a process in place that's a just process to bring people together where everybody feels heard and included. And then through that process, you figure out your shared analysis and your shared goals. And it takes some effort. Just socializing won't bring that about. You have to do some kind of political education, which is why there's an interrelationship between, I think, higher education and community organizing, because you need a kind of understanding of the structural conditions to be able to organize effectively and set goals effectively. At the same time, that that structural understanding is informed by the lived experience. So it's a kind of a symbiotic relationship. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you know, like I would say that for a number of reasons, you know, Yemen was, I think, the most special place in the, you know, so-called Arab world that I visited. I would say it's hard to start explaining all the reasons why Yemen is so special, but from a policy perspective, we could say that, you know, Yemen was unique by giving foreign workers real work visas and instead of the sponsorship visas used by most of the rest of the Gulf. Yemen was the most generous in accepting Somali refugees, and I think Yemen was like the first or the only Arab country to sign the major refugee agreements after World War, you know, that came about after World War II. So, you know, Yemen kind of has this special position where it had a very like open door policy to migrants and refugees. And then Ethiopia has, you know, played the same role in the region where it's one of the major destinations for refugees and migrants. So to have a community that brings together both those places and both those cultures and both those heritages, to me is a very special thing. And personally, I think that transformation comes from, we need transnational organizing, like organizing that reaches beyond national borders. And a community like the mixed Ethiopian and Yemeni community here, it naturally reaches beyond borders. And you can see that it even includes other minority individuals from Arab countries, whether they're like Sudanese ethnic minorities or like an ethnic minority from Syria, that this community brings together people from a lot of different backgrounds. And that's like a powerful foundation for a movement for regional justice. Well, I would say that it's really been a pleasure to get to know so many people. As I said previously, Yemen is a very special place. Ethiopia is a very special place to me because I grew up in a city that has such a large Ethiopian community. So I really enjoyed getting to know everyone. I think that your community kind of represents diversity and tolerance. There's like racial and ethnic and religious diversity all in one community that celebrates both Yemeni and Ethiopian culture, and then reaches beyond that to like celebrate more broadly, you could say like Horn of Africa or East African culture and Arab culture. So like I would say it's a special Afro-Arab unity that people used to talk about and celebrate so much in the 60s and 70s. I think that, you know, maybe that's my own biased perspective, but I think that this community like embodies those values today, and with just a little bit more organizing and political awareness and a little bit more effort, and of course support, a lot could be benefit Yemen politically in the future, looking for a just political future that would benefit Ethiopia as well, and really benefit